Welcome to the Nonlinear Shenanigans, Anshar. I'm not doing the intro this time. It's Nonlinear Shenanigans, so it's always something else, right? But today, I want to discuss with you the eek, eek files. Or do I just beep? Or what do we need to do? Can we say the word out loud, or are we going to be banned on LinkedIn and whatnot? How does that work?
I don't know. I mean the moment that we can't talk about important social issues is probably a sign of something deeper. But
Yeah. So tonight I want to talk to something about that nobody's asking. Um, Not who's not in the files and who's missing and what headline wins. Um, I'm I want to see how you think about this. I keep thinking about how many people actually worked on this document. What is it? 3.5 million pages. So are there just people on a desk with a piece of A4 paper in front of them, a printed email, and with a black marker, like, no, 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 this, let's remove this and this. What is it? 3.5 million pages. Um, if if humans should have done this, then um, up to 100 to 200 people, it's a year of labor, Anshar. So
I mean, even me
I'm
with a
thinking we're missing
2,000,
something.
even me with a 2,000 words a minute reading speed, which is like an 800-page book in 45 minutes, I would have to read nonstop for a year. So it's a lot.
It's
I
really a
do
lot.
before we weigh in on the mechanics of something like that. There's something that was posted on Facebook not that long ago that really caught my attention, and I'm just going to read it. It
Yeah,
says that
go
the,
for it.
the files are everywhere, at dinner tables, in group chats, on podcasts. And in the middle of all the opinions, jokes, debates, and dismissals, someone who has lived through violence is sitting quietly listening closely to how the people they love and respect are speaking about it. So it's important to me that if we're going to talk about adjacent things like data and how many pages and all of that, that we're not skipping over the human element here. I'm happy to comment on that stuff, but it's also a very grave situation. I think that when we don't protect people, and then when we protect the wrong people, or there's a lot of really important dynamics going on, and I know that one of our goals in the Octopus movement is to use nonlinear thinking to address global issues, and I think that exploitation and uh, creating different levels of society with different levels of accountability, all of these things are the kinds of problems that we want to attack as an organization. So I want to make sure that our commentary doesn't step aside, because there are some really important dynamics there. And whether or not we do that in this conversation or a different conversation, I just think it's a conversation worth having. So um, as for
Always
AI and
human
all of that,
centricity. Right.
yeah,
Wait with the AI. Always human centricity. Always, I want to discuss a few things with you and brainstorm from different elements and different angles into the Epstein files and what's going on. And having fun is the not the right word, but it is a nonlinear shenanigan on something that is happening on in this world. And it's always from human centricity that we do that in the octopus movement. The human is the core element. So I'm so happy you said that. And thank you, Janice, for your post on your Facebook page. Right? It's really beautiful. Okay. Um, many people have been working on this document. So I was thinking, on sure, maybe they used AI.
well, there are a lot of tools that classically have been used for large volumes of documents. There are tools like CaseGuard, um, redacting.ai, idocs.ai. There are platforms for that, but I think that there's a problem there too, and that's that anytime that people are involved in an illegal trade, um, there tends to be a lot of referential language or
Hmm.
hidden statements, and those are the kinds of things that an LLM in particular, maybe not another kind of AI that specifically is made to look for it if one exists, but that, you know, you look at our military, or when they're gonna, the president's gonna move from one place to another. They use code words. They use pigeon language. They use things that look completely innocuous to talk about something else. And one of the things that I noticed from the various screenshots and documents and things that I looked at, there are a few indicators that, one, not all of the documents are processed the same way. I think that's clearly evinced by the fact that, for example, just giving an example, I was given one document and asked a question about it, and I used a software that I use to convert PDFs to a different format, and I think 1 out of the 5 documents that I was given, it completely removed all of the blacked out stuff
Yeah,
and
I heard
just put
about
the
that.
original
Yeah.
text there.
Yeah.
So the fact that that's not consistent across the documents means that all of them were not processed a single way, and
No.
that has different levels of concern. First, for protecting victims and all of that, but second, that if you're not running all of this through a common source, if there are, if there's a pigeon language, if there's a lingua franca for, what's going on in a criminal enterprise, people have a tendency to repeat phrases back and forth using special language so that they can avoid accountability. And it's very difficult for any type of a machine-based auditor to be able to catch those kinds of things, because it's in essence a kind of like a shibboleth almost, where there's like an in-group of people using a special language. And that's something that's been around for thousands of years. That's a very, very easy failure point. And I think it's something that a lot of algorithms cannot catch. It's something that a human being has to look at, or at least identify common terms and phrases to make a glossary of these hidden terms that are used. So I do have some concerns about that, regardless of what platform they use. But as an example, there was one large U.S. law firm that used generative AI on like a 126,000 page document set for a government investigation, and they were able to cut their time by 50 to 60%. But the question is at what level of quality? We're in an emerging industry with being able to process language, and I literally just taught a workshop on some of the epistemic failures that happen when we're using a tool like LLM, because sometimes people will treat it like a consciousness when it's it's a bias system. That's one problem. But another is that your prompting and the way that you give instructions, it has to be incredibly explicit. And if you don't know what to look for, if the person who's running something like an investigation, for example, is not someone who's very good at understanding neurolinguistics or in groups or specialty language, or maybe studies criminology so that they can see patterns of behavior, the ability to differentiate different speakers. If you have something coming in from a common email address, but you see regional differences, then maybe 2 different people are logging into the same email account and using it, and there's 2 different people using the account. These are the kinds of things that are incredibly important in forensics that get completely skipped over when you have to process millions of pages of a document. And when you're dealing with lots of people who have high profiles, power, money, that becomes an issue. But it's also about separating signal and pattern from noise. When you create, let's say, a phenomenon where maybe it's built on something that's exploitative, but then it becomes like a public locus of power, people who are in a certain echelon in society may gravitate to that as a meeting place without knowing that something else is going on. Obviously, ignorance is not an excuse, but there's different levels of accountability, and being able to figure out where those levels of accountability lie comes down to the specifics. There is this sentiment
And
of
Anshar, yeah. What I was thinking is, if AI did something or not, and but this was my way of thinking. First, I thought, well, if people did this, then it's a year of work for 100 to 200 people. Maybe they used 1,000. I don't know. Who knows? Is that I don't know if anyone knows. But then I was thinking, if you use AI in a way, and then I thought, yeah, AI or not, there is a policy decision that creates a prompt, even if it's to AI or human beings. There is a prompt towards these documents, and shouldn't that prompt be a public record? Is that prompt not even more important than the 3.5 million? These 3.5 million papers are super important, but is that prompt not even as important as the documents?
Well, yeah, the forensic method by which data is processed and how it's collected, what chain of custody it's gone through, especially if you have concerns that there's a conspiracy or that there's corruption in multiple levels of something, you know, you have to have heterogeneous sources. You can't send things to a single organization for processing. You need to have peer audit and edit. There's a reason that we do those things in academia that make sure that the conclusions that we haven't missed blind spots, that a certain methodology of processing something hasn't created a blind spot. But the risk, the liability of that is that if you section out a document, let's say, and send it to 10 different places, that's not heterogeneous. That's just distributing the workload, right? The idea is to have those documents reviewed by individual entities for transparency. And one of the problems here is that when you have these heavily redacted documents and you've got these decisions as to what to include and not include, and information is not being all made available at the same time, you know, you have to have audit of conclusions that were made. You have to have transparency in that process, because in this country here, just alone, there's been news reports of forensic scientists falsifying results to favor law enforcement, and then people being vindicated after being falsely imprisoned. You've got lots of legal mistakes. I think that it's important, especially when we're talking about different degrees of involvement or proximity to a problem, that we're able to gauge severity of offense. Is it the person, you know, maybe supporting something that's unethical but not knowing it, all the way up to being primarily responsible or even, you know, participating in trafficking or something else. These are all
Yeah.
really, really important issues. And to release all 3.5 million pages or whatever, you know, whatever it is that you're processing, you also want to know exactly how much original source info that has to be a subject of transparency. um, you know, how much of it is actually being released to the public. I know at one point they were putting more effort into protecting the names of the people that were accused than they were protecting the identities of the people,
The
you know, who have been
victims.
hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. And what Mick is saying is also true. They started 20 years ago, right? I understand that this 3.5 million pages is not like, oh, let's print it out and make some black things on it and then publish
Hmm.
it. Yeah, we never know what really happens. What do you think about? I always talk about in within nonlinear thinking the space between thoughts, the emptiness between thoughts, where you don't think whatever brings up into your mind when you're not thinking. What kind of thought is that?
You mean when
And
I'm asleep?
I keep thinking about when I've went to that website where it looks like Gmail, and then you're in Epstein's inbox, and you read some of the stuff, and of course I looked at it, and I keep thinking, what is in between all of this. So of course the obvious thing between the names, between the words, there are black stripes where we don't know what is there. But from our way of looking at things, what is in between all of this? Because if this is a smoke curtain, if this is what it is, if this is almost like a TV series, like where they're uploading the next season and the next season, right? It's almost like entertainment. It's the wrong word, but again, we're doing a
Well, our news has
nonlinear
become an
shenanigans,
entertainment-driven empire. So
right?
to say that, you know, the suffering in the world is being posed to us as entertainment is not wrong.
Yeah.
I think that
I-
there's
Is there something between all of this, in your opinion, between the words, between the people we know and show up in the files? And we all have examples. I don't have to repeat the examples. And sometimes we are shocked and saying, "Well, how is that possible?" And then we see the email that person wrote. Is there something in between all of that we're not talking about and we're not reading, in your opinion?
well, I mean, let's talk about the fact that the pipeline for human trafficking and human slavery and exploitation, some of the same pipelines that were there hundreds of years ago are still in use today, and that
Yeah.
is not a, you know, a phenomenon that stopped. There is also the problem with because of political and economic reasons, often governments are put into positions where they end up funding one side of a conflict. I know that this happened with Bin Laden and all of that. That when they were going against the Soviets, we supplied them with tons of money and weapons. And then a few years later, when that all of that aggression got turned back onto us, and we had September 11th and all of that, then we spent all of that time decrying them. But no one was coming out at the very beginning and saying, "Hey, the reason they have all these weapons and resources is because we gave it to them."
In the first place, yeah.
There's a little bit of an inversion here. I think that when something happens on a big scale like this and a lot of famous people or people in positions of power are exposed, that it can draw public attention to it. But you have to consider also that how big something has to be for people to start talking about it. And there's a real problem with that because we have a lot of silent assent that goes on. There were literally 6 figures of people dying to Boko Haram in Africa for a very, very long time before it was ever on any news station. And instead, people were focused on the stuff that was going on and right in front of them. And I think that when we put all of this time, effort, and energy into saying how reprehensible something is that's in our own system, looking at our own individuals of power, but that we have global policies that allow for that, not just allow for it, but allow resources that our government, pours into, foreign places that allows and facilitates this type of exploitation to happen. There is a bigger issue to discuss here. It's just, this is something that's happening in our backyard in the States. And so now we're out on the back deck looking at it instead of it being something that's abstract in the world. And the idea that we can turn a blind eye to people dying, having their entire way of life taken down, economically destroyed, being exploited for natural resources, and that we have a very laissez-faire policy with that. But then something happens in our backyard and we all want to turn and point and put a bunch of attention on it. That's the problem too. And there's a lot of silent problems going on there. So I think that,
like the slave, sorry, and the slavery in the world as it is today. I saw this impressive movie 1 or 2 years ago about slavery, and it's never been as huge as it is today in numbers. And there was this old FBI agent who didn't agree with the things that were going on, and he created his own foundation, his own nonprofit, and to reduce slavery. And they made a very interesting movie about it. But then you see the numbers, and they explain what's happening in today's world, and we have no idea.
yeah, I mean, you've got everything from people marrying off children that are, 11, 12 years old and it being culturally permissible, to all kinds of, gray areas where they'll call it indentured servitude or something else in order to skip over public review. But what's really happening is direct human exploitation. So I think one of the things that's really key while we're talking about serious issues like this is we don't forget that this is just the signal that's reaching us. And if this is how loud it has to be for people to talk about it, because people were mentioning this phenomenon, years ago.
Yeah.
And it's only when it comes to the point where it's too large to ignore and there's no distraction that can pull us away from it long enough for it to not be a problem, that we'll literally turn and confront it. And there's this thing that and I talked about this in the education paper, cognitive dissonance, the idea of holding two values, in your mind at once, but them not affecting your behavior the same way. The idea that we hold some of these values and can recognize wrongness when it's close to us, but then don't think about what that effect really means as far as our behavior and where we put our money. And there's a lot to talk about and unpack about it. I think that for it to have to be this bad to actually stay in the public eye, that we're now making statements, on public platforms like, well, if we indict everyone, then everything is going to grind to a halt. If all of the people in power in the current system, if this is really the position that you take, that we're going to stop everything and grind it to a halt, if we have so many people in positions of power that are adjacent to something that is so destructive, and our society doesn't grind to a halt, is that more or less of a statement about us? I think that there's a point at which, if injustice is happening, that we have to sit down and have a collective conversation about it, even if it means, if we're going to be willing to shut down the government because there's no money, then we should be able to shut down the government if there's no morality.
Yep.
And
in that way, and I shared it with you already in advance, but I think we should Aikido the smoke. I mean, Aikido, you know that, and a lot of people are saying that the release of the papers in this way, in this shape and form, is like smoke. It's creating a kind of attention that they can control in a way. And I keep thinking, yeah, what if we use that smoke and turn it around and bring it back? And I saw your president creating the Board of Peace instead of the United Nations, and and I saw that. I was like, yeah, why don't we create the Board of Justice as humanity all over the world, regardless of countries and politics? And what does it take to stand up and say, wait a second, this is not okay? And we're saying that, but yet what is really happening? How do you see that? How can we Aikido the smoke?
well, we have to think about our culture. I think the cultural thing is the thing that has to happen first, because if we have a culture of people who try to uh, enforce their personal morality as laws, then we can end up living in a religious state. If we don't create a culture of people who value education and critical thinking, then we create a culture that's easily led by a demagogue. If we don't create epistemic honesty about truth, then the fourth estate collapses, and we have no accountability, and we have no way of knowing who's telling the story and why. Um, when we create like a caucus system, and bypass the free election and reduce people's choices down to the lesser of two evils, and we have to vote based on alignment instead of issues, what happens to our ability to be epistemically honest as voters? There's so many things that have to change in culture, because if you address the problem, then it's just the symptom, and it
Mhm.
means that none of the cultural priors that happened that made something possible are in place. Because I was reading some of these stories that are attached to these files, and the idea that we've created a culture in which a young person will go somewhere and get paid a lot of money to expose themselves when their brain's not even fully developed, and then that person will go grab all of their friends and say, hey, you should come with me, we're all going to get paid lots of money, and all you've got to do is XYZ. um, we're not we're not instilling the critical thinking that we need to be at all the different levels, and teaching people the stories that we choose to tell in things like education is really important. Talking about the onus of society to protect people,
Mhm.
um, because a society is defined by what it does to the weakest of us, the people who need the most help. And it's funny because we talk about rights all the time, but I know, like, here in the States, when World War II happened, we had tons of Japanese American citizens that were completely American citizens, and just because of their racial background, they were taken away from their property, their businesses, thrown into internment camps. Um, if the government has the ability to take away your rights when you need them the most, because that's really what rights are about, is what's there to protect you when all the chips are down. And alarming it is alarming that we have a misalignment, we have cognitive dissonance in how we're doing that. And if we want to make changes that actually stay, then it's not just addressing something when it happens, it's addressing all of the problems that made it happen in the first place.
Do you find it difficult to talk about this topic here online and everybody can see it?
No,
How?
it's not that. It's not. That's an important discussion to have. It's just, it's important to me that we really discuss the gravity of what it means when we create a culture collectively where the most powerful people have the ability to exploit the people who have the least ability to protect themselves. And that if we look at that, if we look at, and a lot of this is a failure and shame driven society. Ever since Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, decided to get involved in products and the economy and try to use fear of rejection, shame, all of those things to sell products, because we used to be a needs-based economy, and now we created this paradigm of, if I don't get this and I don't do this and I don't do this, I won't be enough. When will I be enough? And buy this, buy that. When you create a shame and failure driven economy, then the ability to acquire status, to acquire security, to feel confident becomes a privilege that people are trying to acquire. And I think that like LinkedIn itself as a platform is really demonstrative of that fact. You've got, we took the old paradigm of the job interview where you're sitting down and trying to put the best facade of presentation of yourself, trying to flag yourself with zero shame, zero mistakes, zero negative signal, and to be accepted, into the corporate world or whatever. When really failure is what drives learning, challenge is what drives growth. It's so much more defining to learn about a person's greatest failure and how to inform them and how they want to be and who they want to be. And we don't see a what was your greatest failure category as a normal box on LinkedIn.
You always talk about that, Ansher.
It's true.
You always talk about that, and it's interesting, and it should be there, and because we all have that in common, right? We all made mistakes. We all make
I was
mistakes.
reviewing Jim Quick's work, talking about the effect of what a really dramatic event has on you and how it forces you to change, how it changes your skill set. I mean, look at me. I came from being mostly nonverbal, and now I teach communication. That's taking a failure and changing it into a challenge. And that road had so many failures on it. If I was afraid of failure, I wouldn't even be here in this room talking to you. So it's interesting to me that one of the greatest signals of self-investment, self-engineering success is completely absent on a platform that claims to try to flag those things. And I think that that's just another commentary on how culture affects our decision making, affects the way that we present publicly, how we care about the truth. I think it's part of this greater narrative, because even if we perfectly address this, right? If we hold people accountable, maybe that will make some people feel satisfied. But if it doesn't help create a system that prevents it from happening again, is it really a victory? Or is it just that industry, those collections of people, the people who are doing that thing, writing that off as a sustainable loss because that was the one time they got caught?
Yeah. And that worries me from time to time, thinking, yeah. And then we continue, and then everything stays the same, right? And then there are all these documents, and everybody is surprised, and we all talk about it, and then everything stays the same. Can we change the architecture in how we deal with this, right? Can we do it differently? I think it's necessary.
Well, when we're afraid to speak up, when we don't protect people that speak up, but also, we're also in a space where just making an accusation about someone unfounded has the ability to destroy an entire person's life. We see it happen to teachers all the time. They get, a student gets angry at them or something like that, and they make an accusation. And it turns out that it's completely baseless, that they're just angry that they failed them on a history test or whatever. By the time that the truth
whole
comes
life
out,
is
their life is gone. So we have to have a process by which we can surface the truth, hold people accountable, protect people that are in positions of weakness or exploitability, and at the same time not overcorrect to the point where people start using it as a tool to do damage to one another because of social reprehension. And that's a careful line to walk, because we have to favor the possibility that people can be hurt. And whatever we put into place has to absolutely favor those people, but there has to be as much importance socially placed on when people are found innocent of something, actionably innocent, and to have their name and their reputation cleared when they haven't done something wrong. Otherwise, it creates a social fear of speaking out. We create a social fear of speaking out for a completely different reason that ends up hurting the primary people who are affected.
Yeah, it's that simple. And I agree 100% with Mick. Also, we need to become less afraid of discomfort. That's an interesting sentence that we can discuss for even half an hour or an hour. We
That's
have
how
to
you
become
learn.
more. It's how you do it, but it's so simple, right? We have to become. If it becomes too comfortable, then nothing happens, right? It's okay to make mistakes, but we don't learn that at school. You need to get good grades, you need to do well, you need to do the things that are expected from you, and if you did something wrong, then don't say anything. Whereas say what you did wrong is very inspiring, it's very, very beautiful in a way, and it's good to talk about that. Yeah, so thank you, Mick.
Yeah, failure is incredibly powerful, and it's not about it's about the story that you choose to tell yourself. And when we live in a culture of fear of failure and shame, it it gives us the impression that we are what has happened to us. And two people could have exactly the same life story and make completely different decisions and become different people based on it. And
Yep.
I think it speaks to the difference between what we tell ourselves and who we choose to be. You know, I
So
think
so
yeah.
Anshar, so what I want to do, like the first episode of the Nonlinear Shenanigans, we have the 7 myths about nonlinear thinking. A lot of people found them very interesting and asked, like, can we talk about that a little bit longer?
I so
What
agree
I
with you, Sarah. By the way, just yeah.
um, can we find in just a few minutes' time a conclusion? So here we are with the files. We have an opinion
Can
about it.
can I ask you a question, Perry?
Please do.
Do you think that anyone recognizes the problem of spending a few days in the education system teaching kids about safety and intimacy and all of that and pregnancy protection, but that no one sits down and spends an equal amount of time on what enthusiastic consent looks like and
Mhm.
what it can mean to hurt someone or why agency matters? Do you think that the idea that we place so much focus on pregnancy but not on being able to recognize dysfunction to know when we need to go see a doctor? I mean, there are things that we don't talk about. And I had the humbling privilege of one of the industries that I trained in was the adult industry. And sometimes there were new people there that literally had to be trained how to use, a prophylactic. The idea that they went through that much time of their life and even chose that profession but didn't know how to do that properly. That's an indictment of ourselves as a society. But then the idea that not only did they not learn that, but there's not even a class on what what healthy consent looks like, why it
Yeah.
matters, what happens when it doesn't occur. You know, there's so much to unpack there, and I think that this is about that cultural thing that I was talking about. That there is a gap in the way that we teach, inform, and collectively create our culture, and the way that our society plays itself out is a reflection of that.
So what is the question?
I would just want to ask, do you have an opinion on why there's such an imbalance there that we care so much about pregnancy and so little about agency?
I have no idea. It's
Neither
a
do
big
I.
question. Why? I don't know. I don't understand when I go to a school to teach about nonlinear thinking, being different, and have a lot of fun. And then the principal says to me, can you create a curriculum about how the brain works for these kids? And yeah, we can do that. That's fun. And then the board steps in and says, no, don't do that. We don't want to go there. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why are so many people talking about this in the world
Why don't we
with
talk about identity,
regards?
about trauma, about what happens to your nervous system when you experience something incredibly negative and why you need help. Why isn't that class?
And what about how to ask for help? I don't know how that works with you, but I find that still, I'm 50, I find it still difficult to ask for help. And
One of the biggest lessons of failure I've ever had. Yeah.
right? It's really difficult. Why are we not talking about that? Why are we not talking at school with kids about how do you ask for help? How does your brain work? Why do you think what you think? What is consent? What does sex really means instead of sexual education? What's really going on? What
But I mean,
what's
even history.
what is life,
If
right?
we're going to teach kids about history, we have to teach them about atrocity. We have to teach them
Mhm.
about slavery. We have to teach them about murder and genocide. Because if we don't learn that those are the results of not caring and not watching, not being aware of the problems that have happened in the past so that we don't repeat them, if we reduce historical figures to monoliths, we don't talk about the entire history of a person. If we, I know at one point we literally shot down a passenger airliner, commercial airliner, uh, with just innocent people on it because it, flew too close to our airspace or something. Uh,
Mhm.
but it was on its normal scheduled flight path. And then when asked about it, the president said, "I will never apologize for America." And then we don't even talk about that anymore. That just only
Mhm.
happened 50 years ago, 40 years ago. You know, the idea that a person came to President Kennedy and was like, "Hey, here's a solution for Cuba. Why don't we just take a commercial, passenger plane and then we'll shoot it down and say the Cubans did it and then we can invade."
Mhm.
And then he shot down that plane and said no. How many people said yes? you know it's one thing to have a whole bunch of conspiracy theories, but to completely trust your government, that's a very interesting position. Because I think
Maybe that's a very good conclusion
you can
for
talk to
this
some Native
episode.
Americans and some Japanese Americans and a few other
Yeah.
people just here in the States and ask them about trusting the government. So at what point does our public trust in institutions actually manifest itself, and what do we have in place so that we can trust them? For a long time we had journalism, but the newspaper died. You know,
Mhm.
journalism has turned into sharing a bunch of stuff that they found online, and the people are making decisions behind closed doors in committees and stuff. And in many cases, there's not a journalist sitting in that room anymore because the public isn't interested in it. What does it say about us? What does it say about the culture? What does it say about the fourth estate? What does it say about accountability? Like, there's so much to unpack.
Too much. Too much. And I love the fact that we're at the end of our conversation, but I love the fact that we went, from the Epstein's files to education and consent and 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 saying, I don't know, Mick, you're right. I don't know is a very good statement. I love that. Or I don't understand. I love that as well. Sometimes I don't understand. And let's not pretend we all understand everything. I don't understand things, and I like to ask why and how does it work, and also say, I don't know.
I
And
just
we
get
need to
so
change a few
worried.
things.
I just get so worried when 500 parents will storm a school in a conservative area and argue and scream in front of a school committee about whether or not evolution should be taught to their kids, but they don't have
Hmm.
anything to say about the fact that consent isn't taught to their kids.
Yeah.
There's some basic human contract stuff and cultural stuff here, and I recently saw, I posted this on my LinkedIn. I saw a short, and it was saying that there is a trend now in the US where when students are completely missing assignments, missing, not partial, incomplete, we're like missing assignments, that they still get 50 out of 100 points of credit because they're lifting the grade system. And I was like, that can't be true. So I went and I did my own research. I didn't even go to every single state. I just wanted to see absolutely verifiable cases of it happening. And I put a paper on my LinkedIn, and it's happening. The idea that all of our ability to be able to see whether or not people are actually learning, if they're actually benefiting from the process of learning. Like, this is culture. This is the next generation of people who will be making decisions, and we are failing them. in so many ways. So yes, we need to deal with the symptom. We need to deal with the fever, but we got to address the disease too. And if we don't,
Okay,
then we have problems.
quickly, within a minute. If you confess something, you can learn something. I like that. So let's confess something. You go first. No, I will go first. You can think about confess. Well, I'd like to confess that I find it difficult to ask for help. That's a confession that I make here. That it's really difficult to ask for help. What is your confession, Answer?
When I was first learning about the brain, because I wanted to see if I could make special interest in the brain and understand people, I didn't know where to put that effort. And at first, I put it toward masking. I thought once I can understand people, I can emulate them better.
Oh, I can mask everything. Yeah.
And I put a whole bunch of effort into that. And then I realized one day that my end result from masking was that I was creating connections with people and then basically denying myself the ability to actually feel loved for who I was. Because then when you do that, you create this inversion where even if you acquire the things that you're after, you have to ask yourself, well, if I was who I actually am, would they still like me? So the very thing I was chasing, uh, I'd put out of my own reach. And so I resolved to myself at that point that I was going to move to a policy of radical honesty. And what I didn't know, this is my mid 20s, was how hard it was going to be to do. It took me over 7 months to stop lying. It never occurred to me just how often we default to dishonesty, how often I defaulted to dishonesty, how much more convenient it was, and it it made me ashamed every time I thought that I had gotten to a point where I wasn't lying about anything anymore. I would catch myself with something new. It was like when I was trying to give up hydrogenated oil because I found out about what was going on in Sumatra. And one day I'd gone like 3 months. I was really proud of myself, and I was drinking my coffee, and I looked down at my non-dairy creamer, and it was the first ingredient, the thing I had been pouring into my coffee every single day. Literally the first ingredient was the thing I was trying to cut out of my diet. Sometimes we're blind to what it is that we actually have to change. And going through that process of refining myself, I learned so much from it because I learned what I didn't know about myself and why I was making the mistakes that I was. It taught me the value of what I was doing. And we shouldn't be afraid of failure because it's not about what's happened to us or what we did. It's about what we learn from it and who we become. When we start using failure and shame as signal for self-improvement, then it's no longer failure and shame. And I think that's a lesson that we all have to embrace if we want to start improving ourselves and challenging ourselves.
Thank you, Nonlinear Shenanigan Answer. Thank you for doing this.
Of
See
course.
you next week. See
Can't
you
wait.
next week, people. Then we will talk about something else. And if you have an idea what to talk about, then send us an email,
Let's
info@theoctopusmovement.org.
just balance
Or
serious issues with things that are fun to think about so that this doesn't become a
yeah,
depressing space. We have
yeah,
to talk about the important shit. Let's not skip on that, but let's make sure
important
that
things,
we
but also
pace.
fun
Pacing is
things.
everything.
Yeah, let us be serious from time to time, and then have fun and laugh about it, and not be serious. Maybe we
But
need to
maybe
talk about.
this time it's that we're calling shenanigans instead of engaging in
Maybe
shenanigans.
we should talk about the Muppet Show next week. That the Muppet Show is back on Disney, and I love that. I'm so happy the Muppet Show is back. Maybe we just need to talk about the Muppet Show. We will see. Thank you everyone for watching, for being
Thank you,
with
Perry.
us. Thank you, Answer. See you.